And at this point, we are going to transition into the rest of our identification and ecology of invasive plants section. So I want to welcome back Rebecca Jacobs, who will be assisting with this presentation. And I'm going to share my screen and start off where we left off yesterday. And I just want to note that I know people probably have additional questions, and we could probably keep going on questions forever, but there will be more time for questions, and there will be a dedicated session on program administration on day 3. So thank you for your questions. It's great that you all are thinking about all the details, and we will return to questions. But for now, let's turn back to learning our invasive plant species. And we left off with shrubby honeysuckles, and today we're going to circle back and begin with Norway maple. I know this was a species that we saw at my field site yesterday. Maybe others saw it too. Rebecca, are you with us?
I am. Good morning, everybody. So Norway maple, or Acer platanoides, is a tree species that deciduous tree species specifically, that I am sure many of you are already familiar with, but is worth noting because it is definitely one you will be finding and marking on these plans. It's, of course, got opposite branching and large palmate leaves with a yellowish fall color, kind of a dirty yellow, not a particularly attractive bright yellow fall foliage color. So in the autumn, if you're doing ID and you're possibly confusing it with sugar maple, you'll know for sure that it is in fact Norway maple. When the trees are young, sugar and Norway can be hard to tell as sort of seedlings and young trees, but as they mature, you can see on the left that the Norway maple bark becomes darker and distinctly different. The sugar maple has deeper fissures and is a little more gray. Norway maples tend to be a little more brown in color. The samaras on a Norway maple, or the seedlings, are wider. They're almost linear, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner. And again, much wider. They are more U or V-shaped with our native maple species. And though the leaves resemble sugar maple, when compared side by side, there are typically more leaf tips, and they are typically also larger and just more distinct. You'll see on the lobes, there's many more sort of, like I said, leaf tips, and they do look a bit different up side by side. I mentioned the autumn color, and the best way to tell, and I'm sure as many of you've learned already, is to snap the petiole off, to snap a leaf off, and at the tip of the petiole, if it's oozing a clear fluid, it is sugar or other maple, and if it's oozing a bright white sappy texture, it is a Norway maple. That's one of the easiest ways to distinguish between the Norway and sugar maples when they're in that sort of middle-aged stage, as long as you can actually reach a branch, of course. So they are also allelopathic, so they sort of excrete this toxin. They change the pH of the soil. And though all maples are fairly have these fairly shallow root systems that create dense shade, and not a lot of stuff grows underneath them, you'll find in areas where there's a dominance of Norway maples, you'll find even less understory. Unless, of course, it's something like bishop's weed, which seems to grow quite happily underneath Norway maple.
Thanks, Rebecca. And it's not particularly useful at this time of year, but I'll also just add that in the later summer or over the winter, another helpful thing to look at are buds. So the buds of a sugar maple are brown and pointy, and they have numerous bud scales, whereas the Norway maple buds are more round. They're not round, but they're more rounded, and they're sort of a greenish reddish color with fewer scales. So the sugar maple again has pointy brown buds versus Norway maple buds are more oblong and have fewer scales. Next, we come to privets. These are shrubs that were widely planted for landscaping. They've been used in hedges. The bottom right photo is me standing in front of some large privets at Cannon Hill State Park. These are opposite-leaved shrubs, as you can see in the photographs on the top and the left. And the leaves are toothless. They come to a point at the tip usually. The clusters of flowers and fruits at the ends of the twigs are helpful to distinguish it from honeysuckle, which has fruits that appear in pairs. And this is a deciduous shrub and bird dispersed. These fruits that I'm showing on the top right are shriveled probably from the previous year. So this photograph was taken in May. So not necessarily preferred by birds, but they are sometimes eaten and dispersed by birds. So that's how this shrub hops around in the landscape. And this one I would say is I'd say moderately shade tolerant, but it can grow in profusion in certain sites. We have several different species of privets, and so again, this is an example. This is a case where it's not, unless you are really wanting to go crazy on your botany skills, it's not necessary to identify these to species. You can note the genus, which is Ligustrum spa. There should be a choice for that in iMapInvasives. And we covered our shrubby honeysuckles yesterday. And so at this time, we're going to move to the species that are less common in Maine. These are species that are localized or not yet detected in Maine. And so by localized here, what we meant was present in 8 or fewer counties. So that's a bit of an arbitrary distinction, but we just needed to draw a line someplace. And so that's how this was, this collection was gathered. And so if you're looking at the target list of invasive plants for the program, this is the table 2 on the back side of the target list of species. So starting off with giant hogweed. This is a plant that people have heard about because it is phytophototoxic. So this plant, if you come into contact with the sap, can cause severe skin burns. So phyto meaning plant, photo meaning sun. This has to be, the contact with the sap has to be in the presence of light that requires UV light. Phytophototoxic, toxic, everybody knows what that means. So you may have seen images of the severe blisters and skin burns with long-lasting scars that can happen. This is a plant, this is not a joke. This is a plant that you have to be very careful when working with. This is a very tall plant. So this is a photograph from Craig Ramsey of Ronlamin standing in front of some very tall giant hogweed that's in bloom. And on the top right, you're seeing an example of a leaf, again with Ron's hand and machete there to give you a sense of scale. This is another photograph of myself with not last year's, but the prior year's fruiting stalk in my hand. So again, just to give you a sense of how large these are. These have very pungent odor if you cut the stem, like with the machete that Ron is holding here. And it's a monocarpic perennial, meaning it can live for a number of years, maybe 3 to 5 years, before it reaches maturity and puts up this flowering stalk. So before it flowers, it will be present just as a vegetative, a leaf-only form. So, you know, it can be present and you might not detect it because it's not flowering. So you've got to look for these very large leaves, 3 to 5 feet across, We do have a native lookalike, the American cow parsnip, which also grows in similar habitats of rivers and riparian zones. But those plants are not as tall, their leaves are not as large, and it's not an invasive plant, it's a native plant. It grows, a couple here and there, but it's not going to form a dense stand the way that you're seeing here. There are some other ways to tell them apart, which involves kind of looking carefully at the shape of the flowers. If you have one in question, we can assist with identification. Another way to tell them apart has to do with the color of the stem. Giant hogweed has a purplish blotchy stem that is 2 to 4 inches. This is the flowering stem I'm talking about now. 2 to 4 inches in diameter. Whereas the American cow parsnip is not so wide. It's a less diameter. So that's giant hogweed. Again, the stems can be 8 to 15 feet tall. Next up, we have another very large plant, the giant knotweed. This is the sister species to Japanese knotweed. And this is present occasionally in Maine. These photographs here are from Aroostook County, where for whatever reason, it seems like the plant is a bit more common. This can be distinguished from Japanese knotweed by the shape of the base of the leaves. You may remember yesterday that I pointed out Japanese knotweed having a flat leaf base as opposed to this cordate leaf base or heart-shaped leaf base of the giant knotweed. And the leaves of giant knotweed are longer and more tapering than those of Japanese knotweed. So in the left-hand picture, you've got my foot there against the leaf for sort of a size comparison. I'm a lady's size 8. So it's a large, long leaf. The proportions are longer than Japanese knotweed. And I will also say that these two species, the giant knotweed and the Japanese knotweed, are known to hybridize. The hybrids are fertile and they can back cross with either parent, which produces a bewildering array of plant shape. So in the photographs that I've showed you, it's very clear that this is a giant knotweed and not a hybrid. However, I have found, and people do find, stands that are intermediate in character, and they are surely some hybrid. So just be aware that if you find a stand that you're like, oh gosh, I'm not sure whether this is Japanese knotweed versus giant knotweed, there is a hybrid. And I'm just making a note to myself to make sure. I'm pretty sure we have that as a species in iMapInvasives, but I will check that out and add it if it's not there. Again, this is much less common than Japanese knotweed, but occurs sporadically in the state. I'm going to turn it back over to Rebecca to talk about hardy kiwi.
Okay, so hardy kiwi is a woody vine that can grow up to 20 feet annually. It has gray and flaky bark as it matures. The leaves are heart-shaped at the base and are gently toothed with prominent venation. You can see in the lower right-hand corner, the venation is such that it sort of resembles a dogwood or buckthorn in that those deep prominent veins. They have distinctly red petioles on the leaves as well. You can also see that on the yeah, there you go. She's got hers. Good job. The flowers are sort of nondescript, greenish white in the spring. And it is grown primarily for its fruits. They mature in autumn. They're small, fleshy green and edible. They hang from little stalks, more like a crab apple that you would see. And then, though they look much more like a grape, and they they fruit in about 3 years. It takes about 3 years for them to fruit. They are popular in permaculture and were initially brought in as an ornamental, but they are, again, sort of mostly grown for their fruit. They grow happily in open habitat and or closed canopy forests. So you can see in that upper right corner that they're growing in the open gaps, but they're also growing quite happily up the trees and into the forest, forested canopy. So this is definitely a plant that I have seen here in mid-coast Maine, but very intentionally planted and managed to a greater or lesser degree and known by the landowners. So that's hardy kiwi.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'll just say that there is interest and concern about this plant because it is one that some folks are very interested in using as sort of a small-scale agriculture growing opportunity. So this is kind of a difficult plant to talk about sometimes. Folks have claimed that it's not really invasive, but there are known examples of populations that were not planted. There are scientific papers documenting this in Connecticut. There are known locations in Western Massachusetts where it definitely was not planted. So there is evidence that it can spread by seed, and certainly it behaves very invasively in the landscape. Going on to another woody vine, Japanese honeysuckle. So this is the only vining honeysuckle that is invasive. We do have, there are some other vining honeysuckles that are ornamental that are not known to be invasive, but Japanese honeysuckle is it's a woody vine that can climb or trail on the ground. So in the photos on the right, you're seeing both a habit where it sort of trails on the ground in the lower photo and a habit where it's climbing up on other plants and here buildings. And similar to the shrubby invasive honeysuckles, the Japanese honeysuckle is known for its fragrant large flowers. You can pull out the stamens and taste the nectar in the flowers. This is something that kids in the Mid-Atlantic have done for years. And the flowers are larger than those of a shrub honeysuckle, but it's a similar plant in the sense that it has opposite leaves that are in the Japanese honeysuckle, these are a bit more pointed typically than in a shrub honeysuckle, which typically is more oval shaped, but they're opposite. And it's a woody vine with a shreddy bark. So similar to our shrub honeysuckles, which when large have kind of a shreddy aspect to the bark. The honeysuckle vine also has that aspect. The fruits of Japanese honeysuckle are black at maturity. So that is quite different than our shrub honeysuckles. And this is really only known from a handful of planted locations in Maine. I think it's just on kind of the northern edge of where it's happiest in terms of its growing habits. So that's our vining invasive honeysuckle, Japanese honeysuckle. Next up, we come to another vine, but this one is not woody. This is a herbaceous vine. This is an annual species, so it grows from seed every year. So the photograph on the right is all a single year's growth of a plant that grew from seed that year. So you can get a sense of how aggressive it can be. It is a vine that has these little backward pointing barbs on the stem. So it's not very pleasant to work with. They're not as woody as like a multiflora rose, which will really, break your clothing. This is just, it's an annoyance, and it will, make it hard to sort of pull them because they get stuck on things. This is a plant that has, it's very aggressive in open areas. It's not super shade tolerant. So since we don't have it in Maine, it's hard to say exactly how it will behave in our habitats, but perhaps less of a threat to the forest interior and more of a threat along woods roads and in openings, but that could include silvicultural openings. So just to bear that in mind. The leaves are alternate along the stem, and you can see these distinctive circular structures, which are called ochrea, which are present on the stem. So biologically, these are little modified leaves, and they probably provide some photosynthetic benefit, but they're a great little ID character for recognizing this vine. Again, those are called ochrea, O-C-E, I can't spell without writing things down, ochrea, O-C-R-E-A. And the leaves are triangular in shape, sometimes with a little bit of the heart shape at the top of the leaf. The flowers are in clusters. So these are the fruit here, but before fruit come flowers. And so these flowers are in clusters. And the fruit, when mature, are these striking blue and purple colors. The flowers are sort of inconspicuous and white. And the fruit have some dark glands on the surface. So that's mile a minute. We don't have this yet in Maine. So, if you think that if you think you find this, please, report it to iMapInvasives with pictures and give me a call because I'll be very curious to come and help assist the landowner with eradication. So this would be an early detection, rapid response species in Maine, and one that we definitely would like to keep out of our state. I think nope, this is me. So next we come to a plant that is sort of a wildflower type plant. This is an annual plant, ornamental jewelweed, also known as Himalayan balsam or simply pink jewelweed, Impatiens glandulifera. So this is a plant that likes to grow in wet areas. So along riparian zones or even in ditches or just moist soil. It can form very dense stands where you don't find good native vegetation. So these are taking up the resources needed and blocking out the sunlight and just competing for space. It can be a tall plant, up to 2 meters tall. So, I've stood in stands of this and, it's been kind of at eye height for me. The flowers are larger than those of our native jewelweed, the orange jewelweed that you see also in wet areas. The two species can grow side by side, and it can be a little confusing until you get the eyeball for it. But you can tell them apart pretty readily because of the shape of the leaves and the degree of toothiness on the ornamental jewelweed. So you'll see how these leaves are really lance-shaped. They're very long, tapering, and they have distinct teeth on the leaf edges. And our native jewelweed does too, but the teeth are less sharp. They're a little bit more scalloped. The leaves on this plant are opposite or whorled. So again, whorled meaning multiple leaves coming out of one place on the stem. So it's sort of around the stem. And what else do I want to say about this plant? This was, brought as an ornamental. It seems to be the worst in mid-coast Maine. It's definitely really bad in the Rockland and area. It's known at Cannon Hill State Park and other places in the mid-coast. And it's an annual plant. It spreads by seed. The water courses, unfortunately, move the seeds around. And so here is an example of where, starting with an upstream population and controlling there first before working your way downstream can be useful. The seeds are known to live for at least 3 years in the soil. So dealing with this species is definitely a multi-year approach. But it pulls really easily. So with a group of volunteers, you can make a lot of progress. I learned the hard way that cutting it back, just cutting the stems, is not sufficient to prevent it from regrowing and forming flowers and producing seed. So you actually should really pull it, or you might have to cut it more than once to prevent it from producing fruit. So that's our pink jewelweed or Himalayan balsam. Turn it back over to Rebecca.
Okay. So Nancy hesitated on the pink jewelweed because I've been jumping up and down for years living in the mid-coast, and I am pulling it on multiple sites annually. I'm putting it on many of my management plans for invasives here in the Mid-Coast area. It is definitely a little beyond concern for me at this point. So anyways, we hope it doesn't go into your counties. So Porcelainberry Ampelopsis, glandulosa, or Brevic pedunculatas are deciduous woody vines. They grow at a rate of about 10 to 15 feet annually. They are in fact a relative of our native grapes. Their leaves are alternate and palmate. They have a heart-shaped base and with 3 to 5 deeply lobed, they're very distinct leaves in the landscape. And their stem pith is white, whereas on a native grape, they are brown. And their bark is not peely. So the vines are not that peely typical grape bark that we see, again, with our native or even non-native vines for that matter. So it's not a peely bark. They have inconspicuous greenish white flowers between June and August. And they are grown for their beautiful fruits and edible fruits. They fruit in September through October, and they go through a multicolor fruit change, starting with a pale lilac and turning a kind of greenish color, and then eventually getting to a really quite bright blue. You can see the blue forming in the upper right corner, but when fully mature, they are quite a deep cobalt blue. This is definitely a species of concern for woodland habitats because they are quite happy to invade open wooded habitats. And it is definitely a species of concern. I first learned of this particular species from Les Meerhoff down at UConn over 20 odd years ago. And he confessed that he had planted one on his property because they were oh so beautiful and tasty, and that he was probably going to live to regret it. So hopefully it has not invaded the Connecticut River Valley, but it is definitely a species of concern down in southern New England and mid-Atlantic states where I first learned of it, and I hope it does not come this way.
Becca, I had in my notes that you took this one, but I'm not sure that's right. Did you want to do this one?
Yep, I did take that one. That's fine. So this is Japanese stilt grass, or Microstegium venenium. It is an herbaceous annual grass. The leaves are 2 to 4 inches and pointed at both ends and about 1/2 inch wide. The midrib, which is a little bit hard to see here, but is worth noting. Oh, good, Nancy's got her little pointer out there. The midribs are often sort of silvery in color, which also helps to distinguish them on the landscape. The leaf edges are smooth and they are alternate but well spaced. They're very distinct. You can see in the lower right corner an infestation, so you wouldn't know necessarily from one grass to another. But when you get up close, it's that distinct spacing, that very sort of 2 to 4 inch length in the stem, very pointed on each end, the silvery midrib. Once you've seen it, it really kind of stands out in the landscape. They turn a purplish brown color in the fall as they die back. They're quite weak. Root systems are easily pulled up from the ground, and they're often multi-stemmed at the base if you're looking at a single plant. But because of the root nodes or the stilts, they will quickly and readily root and spread, as you can see, along the ground quite readily. The flowers are closed with 1 to 2 or 3 spikes on the tips, and they form late summer through early fall. This is, they form very dense massings. They average between 6 inches and 3 feet when found most often, but can grow up to 6 feet in height. In winter, in the northern areas, the thatch would appear a bright tan to orangish color. And this is a definite problem plant for our woodland habitats. It is a plant that's of great concern across North America and has invaded the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic quite heavily. So this is, again, something we don't want in this area. And as an annual, it's pretty scary to see how quickly it can spread.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. I'm just going to add a note that unfortunately we had our first 2 detections of stiltgrass in Maine this past fall. So these photos that you're looking at here are from Maine. One site was at a nursery in York County, which was a nursery that's a wholesale nursery that's actually in the process of closing. So we're lucky in the sense that it wasn't a retail nursery because people walking around can pick up the seeds. The seeds are very tiny. In the top right picture, you're seeing a seed head on the far right of the clipboard. And you can see, compared to my hand, the size of these seeds and how tiny they are. And it's very, very easy to transport them in the mud on your boots. So we're lucky it wasn't a retail nursery where there were tons of people walking around, but the infestation is not small, and we'll be working with the landowner to hopefully address it. The other site that was detected last fall was in Georgetown, and it's on multiple properties, private properties there. So I'm very grateful to the U.S. Forest Service. We did just receive notice that we have a grant to do treatment and suppression. So hopefully be working with those landowners for the next few years to try to get these populations under control. So it is unfortunately at this point confirmed in Maine, but only in 2 locations. And again, if you think you found this, please give me a call. This is a high priority species because it is completely shade tolerant, and the buildup of thatch that Rebecca described can prevent seeds of our native tree species from reaching the soil. And so it's a serious problem. Those of you who've seen it to our south know that this is a really very bad invasive plant that we need to keep contained in Maine. So thanks, Rebecca, and back to you for Tree of Heaven.
Okay, Tree of Heaven, or Ailanthus altissima, is a fast-growing deciduous tree, reaching up to 80 feet in height. And as far as I can tell, in terms of its habitat, it can grow absolutely anywhere. In fact, I wonder that's why it says Tree of Heaven, whether it was the fast rate of growth reaching to heaven or because it can grow from here all the way to heaven. It was introduced as an ornamental over time, but has lost popularity due to its weedy nature combined with its foul odor when the stems are broken or leaves are crushed. Its bark is slightly rough and pale gray. And as it matures, there are sort of not colorful, but sort of a colored striation, there we go, in the bark. So giving it almost a reptile-like appearance on mature trees. The stems are yellowish to red in color. The leaves are alternate and pinnately compound, with leaves containing 13 to 40 leaflets. And the leaflets themselves are 3 to 5 inches long and approximately 2 inches wide. They are slightly toothed along the edge. And when a leaf is broken off, the leaf scar will leave a triangular shape, or some people call it a shield-like shape, in the yellowish color on the stem. The foliage in unattractive yellow color and would not be confused with any of our native sumacs with that get the bright crimson color. Stems are sort of a stout looking stem with also sort of yellowish in color. This tree I first identified in Springfield, Mass, and growing on a gravel pile, and then a few, yards later, growing in the cracks of the sidewalk, and then another short walk later, elsewhere. So it will literally grow anywhere.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. I just want to clarify that the leaflets, they do look like they have sort of teeth at the bottom because they have these bumps where there are some glands on the underside, but the majority of the leaflet edge is smooth, which is another way to distinguish it from a plant like our native sumacs that have teeth on the edges. Okay, moving on to another annual herbaceous plant, wall lettuce. So this is sort of an emerging invasive plant. We don't know that much about its impacts because it hasn't really been studied much, but you can see in these photographs, especially the top right, how abundant it can be in the understory of a forest and how aggressively it can spread. So that is always of concern when you find a non-native plant in the forest behaving this way. So this is a 2 to 3 foot tall annual herb that is shade tolerant. On the lower left, you can see the kind of open inflorescence of many, many 5-parted yellow flowers. These are small flowers about a 1/2 inch wide. And when pollinated, the flowers produce a seed head that's like a little dandelion head. So lots of tiny little wind dispersed seeds. Or, you know, if a deer is walking by, the seed can kind of get stuck in the fur. Or if you are walking by, it can get stuck on your pants. So it's very challenging to move through stands of wall lettuce because you feel terrible because, you know, you feel like you're spreading the thing if it's in seed. The leaves of the plant are very distinctive. They are these deeply lobed, toothy, very sort of irregular shaped leaves that clasp the stem. So you can see on this lower right photo, it's kind of out of focus at the top, but you can see how the leaf clasps the stem, which is why I left the photo in here. And you can also see the shape of the leaf with the very toothy edges. So a very divided leaf with toothy edges that clasps the stem, small 5-parted yellow flower in the forest understory. This again is an annual flower. So that brings us to the end of the table 2, the localized or not yet detected plants in Maine. Because we have a couple minutes still, I want to just proceed. I've got just 2 other plants that you've probably heard about. And so they may not be a threat typically in the forest, but I wanted to just introduce you to purple loosestrife, as well as one other wetland plant. So purple loosestrife is a wetland plant. This is a long-lived, kind of woody at the base species. And at one time, it was so rampant in our wetlands that it looked like just a purple monoculture out there. There has been a good story here with biological control. This is a plant for which a complex of beetles was identified and researched carefully and then reared and released to help control purple loosestrife. So there was a leaf-feeding beetle and a flower-feeding beetle, and as well as, I believe, a root-feeding beetle that were released, and that has made a real difference. And so many places, you know, you still see purple loosestrife, but instead of being a really dense, horrible monoculture like this, it's, you know, a handful of plants here and a handful of plants there. That's the expected result from biocontrol, not that the biocontrol would eradicate the species from the landscape, but that it would help to really suppress and contain it. So purple loosestrife flowers in late summer. We're talking, you know, late July or August. And it has these spikes of pink to purple flowers. It can sometimes be confused with fireweed, but the flowers are smaller on purple loosestrife, and the leaves on purple loosestrife are opposite or whorled. And yeah, so overall, just a different shape to the flowers and plant form. As I said, this is a wetland plant, so less likely, unless you're in a riparian forest, to be a target species for our program. Next is another wetland plant, yellow iris. This is a showy iris species, which has been used ornamentally and, including in drier habitats, but where it does the ecological damage is in wetlands adjacent to ponds, as you're seeing in the top left. Even in forested wetlands, as you're seeing kind of on the right. This was sort of a funny site up on MDI that was just a damp area in an early successional area. But these are a very robust iris. This will grow, unfortunately, in salt, brackish, and freshwater wetlands. So many different types of wetlands, including salt marshes that are more brackish. And it can form dense stands that crowd out native vegetation, as you can see in this photograph here. It also can infest lake shores and sort of the fringing vegetation around the edges of a lake. We've got a couple of examples where I've been working with folks from the Maine Department of Environmental Protection and some lake protection groups, because this is sort of this is a plant that it's not truly aquatic, but it's kind of one of those hybrid plants that straddles a line between terrestrial and aquatic. And it's more robust overall than our native blue flag iris, but it can be difficult to distinguish unless it's in flower. So when I say more robust, it's larger. The pods are larger, but there's enough overlap in the the average sizes and stuff that it can be challenging to tell apart unless it's in flower. So it flowers sort of midsummer here in Maine, and that's a great time to try to pick that out. So that's the end. I'm going to go back to the thank you slide and say thanks again to Rebecca Jacobs from Knox-Lincoln Soil and Water Conservation District for assisting with this presentation. And what I'd like to do now is pause and see if there are any questions from our audience regarding identification and ecology of these plants. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Nancy, there were a couple of questions that came up during the presentation. One from Eric Grove. I believe this was in reference to mile-a-minute weed. Is there a similar native plant? He's seen something like it on ledgy outcrops throughout New England when doing contract timber cruising.
Yes, there are some similar native plants, and I'm just pulling up a website that I will share here in a minute. So bear with me. Yeah, so there is, so the mile-a-minute weed is not super closely related, but it is somewhat related to, well, I'm not even going to go there. So this plant that I'm showing, fringed bindweed, this is a similar plant that is can grow abundantly in old landings and other sort of open areas. This is a native plant. You see this green color on the Go Botany map, but it is a vine, and it is it has sort of a triangular shaped leaf. It tends to have a little bit more of the heart-shaped base, as have several plants that we've mentioned today, but it can grow aggressively and be abundant. So I've gotten many calls about this plant. As Arthur Haynes is a great botanist. He notes it's characteristic of recently disturbed areas such as cleared forests, roadside stumps, gravel pits, and on rocky ground. So again, this is something that you can find in ledgy areas, even in the woods. So I've seen this plant, including in the woods. So that's one. We also have a black bindweed, which I believe is not a native plant. And these can be tricky. Oh, sorry, hold on. So fringed bindweed, it's called fringed because at the base of the leaf stem, where the leaf attaches to the stem, it has a fringe, and that's what's being shown in these photographs here. So if you've got a plant that it's a little vine and it's climbing everything, and it doesn't have so again, the leaves of this fringed bindweed are different from mile-a-minute in the sense that they have this more heart-shaped base, and they're a little scalloped around the edges, whereas the mile-a-minute leaves are really very triangular overall in shape, and they don't have any teeth. So if you've got something and you're like, well, this is a kind of aggressive vine, but it doesn't immediately look like mile-a-minute, check for this fringe at the bottom of the leaf petiole where it attaches to the stem. And then I was going to show you black bindweed, which looks similar but does not have a fringe. This is a non-native plant that also will grow aggressively in similar kinds of habitats. And this is, I wouldn't say that this is a truly invasive plant. It's just sort of an aggressive weed. So those are the kinds of habitats that it can grow in. So fringed and black bindweed could be confused with myelominate.
Great. Next question. Let's see. Sorry, I'm having some bandwidth issues here on my end, a little bit slow. Ron Lemin asks, is this the same lettuce that forest industry has been having trouble with on young plantations in northern Maine? It gets 5 to 6 feet tall on these young sites.
I don't think so, Ron. I think that that lettuce is one of the more true lettuce species, either a lactuca or something like that. I feel like it's a tall, I think it might be called tall blue lettuce. I'm just trying to pull that up here. Yeah, I've gotten calls about this. I think I've got giant hogweed, and you know, they send me a picture, and it's this tall blue lettuce, grows really tall, and it's just a very impressive looking plant. I don't know if this is the one from northern Maine, Ron, but it could be. This is a native plant present throughout Maine. So to answer your question, no, I don't believe wall lettuce is the same as what you're describing. It could be this species that I'm showing here, this Lactuca biennis tall blue lettuce.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is. It's like 5 to 6 feet tall, but it looks it looks the same. It's just taller. That's all.
Yeah. So I guess I know it can be hard when we're starting to learn plants. I don't think that this plant looks the same as the one that I just showed you. So again, this has a small panicle of yellow flowers versus that tall blue lettuce that had a really tall spike of flowers. So we need to just, look with a careful eye, because, as we learn them, we learn better how to distinguish them.
Do they have the white? Do both of them have the white milky sap when you bust them open?
Good question, Ron. I don't remember about wall lettuce, whether it has a white milky sap.
The tall blue does.
Yeah, okay. That kind of detail might be the sort of thing that's noted on the Go Botany page, and I can make a note to myself to see if I can figure that out for wall lettuce. Thanks for your question, Ron.
Okay, a follow-up from Morton. He's asking about tear thumb, Persicaria or erifolia, and being similar to myelominate weed. Is that something that others are seeing as well?
The Persicarias are related to the myelominate, and there's a lot of different Persicarias, so I hesitate to comment. But yeah, I mean, they might be confused. The Persicarias that I'm most familiar with have a longer leaf blade. They're less triangular in shape, so that's my initial response. But some of them do have little barbs, so maybe that's why these two species, the myelominate and the tear thumbs, have potentially become confused.
Yeah, that was referenced as well. And then there's a few people asking if you can let us all know where the giant hogweed has been found in Maine.
So I will refer people to the Go Botany distribution maps for sort of general understanding, and to the iMapInvasives website for specifics. It's good to note that we only map things in iMapInvasives with landowner consent and knowledge, so we don't always have that, and so some known sites we don't have in iMapInvasives, but I can say that for the hogweed, it's known in the greater Augusta area. It's known in the greater Bangor area. Ron Lemin can probably chime in here if there's other sites. It's known on MDI at Old Estates. It's not widespread. I mean, it's not a plant that you're going to find commonly. So don't be scared. Like, it's not a plant that you're going to stump. It's not typically a plant that you're going to see. I've never mapped it myself on one of our NRCS properties. Okay.
Let's see, I think that was it for questions about this section. But if others want to ask additional questions, feel free to put your hand up.
And in the meantime, I'll just show, I have looked up, oh, it does look like somebody has their hand up. Randy, you have your hand up.
Yeah, hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Do you have time to talk about bed straw? Is that invasive?
Sure, I can say a couple of words about smooth bed straw. So bed straw is a low trailing plant that is often found in open fields. And we have numerous species of bed straw in Maine, including many native species of bed straw. Typically, our native species of bed straw are sticky. They have little tiny protrusions along the stem that make them feel sticky, like they'll stick to your clothes. There is a non-native bed straw called smooth bed straw, which is not sticky. And it is invasive. It is invasive in an agricultural sense. So it is not a plant that typically invades natural areas, unmanaged areas. I mean, it can invade hedgerows, but it is primarily of concern in hayfields. And it's a big concern in hayfields. It is a real problem. I can show, let me show, so sorry, just grabbing the website here, smooth bed straw. So this is a plant that, you may have people ask you about, and I refer people to the good folks at, sorry, I'm not finding the plant, obviously, so let me just search by the species name. I can share my screen here. Gallium. I would refer people to the good folks at UMaine Cooperative Extension who've done a bunch of research on this species. Okay. So here it's being called world bedstraw. Arthur Haynes sometimes uses different common names than the rest of us, but yeah, so you can see the world pattern on the stems. It flowers white. It's a very aggressive sort of trailing plant in hayfields. And as he says, it's often a weed, whorls of 6 to 8 leaves and hairless stems. So yeah, if folks are in areas where people are trying to grow hay or other crops, this can be a real problem. It's not something that we see typically in the forest or that I think of as being of a strong concern in natural areas. So that's kind of my take on that one, Randy.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Ron, did you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Sure. Is the bindweed the same as buckwheat, or are they two different plants? Is bindweed in the buckwheat family?
Bindweed is in the buckwheat, blah, blah, blah. Bindweed is in the buckwheat family, Ron, and there are a number of different plants. Where can I move this? So there are a lot of plants in that family. So so the family is given here in Go Botany on the panel on the left here. So there are a lot of plants in this family. Does that answer your question, Rod?
Yeah. I've heard people call it two different things, and I just didn't know if we're going after the same problem or not. So we are. So
yeah.
good.
Yeah, so the scientific name for myla weed is also, the genus is also Persicario. So same genus, in fact, not just same family.
Another question in the chat from Dean: should we be able to identify the specific shrub honeysuckles?
If you want, go for it. You really need flowers or fruit, Dean, to identify those two species, or you need a lot of familiarity. So Sometimes I feel like I can do it because they're different in terms of the hairiness of the leaves, but you don't need to for this program. So you just need to be sure that it's not a native honeysuckle, that it is one of the invasive shrub honeysuckles. And so again, the invasive shrub honeysuckles are plants that have they have opposite leaves. The leaves are sort of oval in shape. I'm going to show photographs here. Where are they? Shrub honeysuckles. Okay. And share screen. Share. I should just stay sharing. Where's my, yeah, here we go. Shrub honeysuckles. So shrubby honeysuckles, they have opposite leaves. The leaves are typically hairy on both sides of the leaf. But the Tatarian has no or very few hairs, and the invasive honeysuckles have at least a small hollow chamber in the pith. So you do not have to identify these to species for this program. If you want to, make sure you submit pictures because we'll have to verify. So I would suggest not trying to identify these to species for the sake of this program. Other questions? While we're in the vein of thinking about how to look for plants and see what their distribution is, again, Go Botany is a great resource. The iMapInvasives website for invasive plants actually sometimes has more information. So just as a heads up, I'm going to be coming into boot camp here in a minute to talk about more functions of iMapInvasives, and we'll go over how do you search for a specific species to see its distribution. And if I have time, I'll go over how we add a distribution layer, which sort of mimics the layout of the Go Botany, which shows you the counties. So stay tuned for that.
So Jake is asking, he has a landowner who says he has bed straw in a field in the middle of his forest, and he's asking about whether that will qualify for this program.
I'm going to defer. I mean, I don't think that this program, I don't think the intent of this program is to treat bed straw in that field. I mean, to drop a point and say that there's bed straw there and mention it in the plan is fine. But again, the intent of this program is not to provide in-depth management advice for agricultural invasive plants, which I would consider smooth bed straw to be.
I agree.
Camp, and I want to say thank you again to Rebecca Jacobs for her help with the invasive plant identification and ecology portion of our training.